Let's start with a prayer that was written during this era that a lot of us know, the St. Michael the Archangel prayer.
Perfect.
And maybe if there's time, we'll talk about that here. I don't know. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. So, a brief history of the church, very, very brief. The modern age. In the situation here, the spirit of the Renaissance is continuing as Europe is really looking to expand. There's a fighting competition to acquire lands in the New World. And a lot of us know this from some more recent history. One of the things that happened during this era is the kings and nobles greatly started to dislike those Jesuits that we talked about last time. The Jesuits who actually held things together after the Reformation for a great degree, but they were preaching in public about, I don't know, the moral responsibilities of the government leaders. So they didn't like it very much. They also wrote books and articles. They questioned some aspects of the Enlightenment that they thought was just a little too over the top. In response, one by one, the Jesuits were being expelled from different countries. Spain, Portugal, and France, among the biggest ones. Pope Clement XIV was a little too weak to resist these powerful political demands. So he suppressed the Jesuit order officially as the Pope. He wrote one simple sentence, a true politician, for the sake of the peace of the church, one must sacrifice even beloved persons.
That's harsh.
Isn't that awful? The irony is, they didn't take the Pope out. The irony is, the Jesuits had made a vow of complete obedience to the Pope. So they obeyed. Isn't there a little bit of bad irony in there?
Yeah.
They think about 20,000 Jesuit priests and brothers were discharged from service at that time.
Was that just in
It was worldwide, except one country refused. Catherine the Great in Russia refused to implement the papal order. So only in Russia, there were about, I think, 120 Jesuits that remained in Russia. Worldwide, though, they were basically excused. It's like they were fired. They were fired, basically.
So they weren't priests anymore.
They are no longer active servicemen. Yeah, they were priests. In 1776, you may have heard that date before, the 13 colonies in the New World, they issued their Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. The brilliant ideas that were put forth in that founding document that this nation was founded on was greatly influenced, a lot of it by some of those thoughts that came through the Enlightenment. And also a lot of it was carried by a really heavy philosophy and theology, a theology of the human person that actually comes from Catholic thought. The idea that everyone is created in the image and likeness of God, that we have an ordained right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness because we are children of God. That's a very Catholic idea. Also very tied up with those ideas of the Enlightenment. Kind of interesting.
I was just going to say, but don't get too carried away with that idea that this is a Catholic document or a Catholic founding.
It's not.
It's not.
Yeah.
It is not. Our nation was very actually anti-Catholic at this point in time, right? Every colony in the New World except Pennsylvania had laws that were anti-Catholic laws, like against Catholicism.
We weren't allowed to own land.
Yeah, there was like all kinds of
colonies.
stuff, right? Like very suppressive to Catholics. They weren't considered Christians, so they weren't allowed to do certain things and that sort of thing, right? Oh, I didn't write this one down, but I read this great thing online yesterday that there was a time in the late 1600s, early 1700s, when Protestants would go to church, they had to bring to their church on Sunday a Bible and a gun. And then before they left church, the men went first to secure the outdoors before the women and children were dismissed in case Catholics might be around.
Wow.
Like, really, that's what they thought of us, okay? So
I don't think we had that much violence going on in
it
the
wasn't
free
a
world.
very pleasant
Definitely.
time to be a Catholic in the New World. In fact, when the American Revolution was going on, when the actual war was happening, a common battle cry of men going into battle was "No king, no pope." That was a very
Wow.
common battle cry.
Despite that, one of the signatories of the Declaration
Mhm.
was Catholic, Charles Carroll, who was a very rich man who owned a lot of land. I never did read how he got all that land, but he was very wealthy and he was
Took it from a
Catholic.
Protestant.
He took it from the Protestants and he was Catholic. So do you want to talk a little bit about, well, not yet, actually.
Not
We'll
yet.
talk about the comparison between France and this.
Yeah.
So 1789, so I didn't realize in my little head, this was simultaneous while Jefferson is going to be rising up to be the president. Jefferson loved France, if you remember some of that. He was constantly going back and forth to France. He loved France. During that time, the French Revolution is beginning in France.
And something important to notice too about this time period, right? The French Revolution comes right on the heels of the American Revolution, obviously, we know that. But what a lot of people don't realize is the French government was broke at the time of the French Revolution because of all of the support they had given to the colonies to overthrow Britain, right? So France supported the US, the then, colonies in our revolution. And then when they were absolutely broke and a revolution was about to break out for them, they asked us for help and we said, sorry, we can't afford to. We're a foundling nation, we've got nothing, right?
We didn't have any taxation
We
yet.
had nothing to give them. So
Around 1789, King Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette, we've heard of those, they literally lost their minds. But in the French Revolution, as that began, that went over like a.
They're
like
both really devout Catholics. Louis the 16th and Marie were devout Catholics, but he was a horrible decision maker. And when France was really financially devastated, he didn't know what to do. He just didn't know what to do to fix his country.
So there was a huge revolt against them. Now, unlike the United States across the ocean, the battle for liberty in France degenerates into a chaotic bloodbath. Okay. Do you want to talk about one of the reasons why the colonies didn't experience so much?
I mean, ours was a chaotic bloodbath.
It was at
too.
first.
Yeah. But one of the differences between the U.S. and France, think about the nation, or the continent of North America at that time, right? And the colonies are all along the East Coast, right? Well, if you don't like the way it's going where you are, you just move west. Right? If you don't like the anti-Catholic law, you move west. If you don't like the way the new government is set up and run in your little colony area, you move west. There's lots of land and lots of options to just get out from under what's going on in your neck of the woods, right?
Can't do that in France.
Not so much a possibility in France. Like,
there's no open land.
Your land is your land, and that's all you got. So nowhere to go.
So while this is degenerating into chaos, the rulers of France, the new rulers who happen to be in power for 3 seconds before the next rulers come on the scene, they demand that priests and bishops swear an unconditional oath of allegiance to the new regime, and then to the next new regime, and then to the next new regime. So the revolution then becomes violent and radical in 1793. It's what's known as the Reign of Terror, if you remember that. Priests are killed, they're driven into exile, there's this mass murder, there's all kinds of chaos, looting. It's a terrible time.
It's basically government-sponsored genocide against Catholics during the Reign of Terror. In fact, in Vendée, France, from 1793 to 1794, the report I read said hundreds of thousands of Catholics were killed. Now, I don't, that sounds like an exaggeration a little bit. I don't know if they have that many people, but it's a lot of people, regardless, right?
You may remember there was a point in the Cathedral of Notre Dame where they even set up a statue to the Goddess of Reason. If you remember that. Then one of the movements of the new government is France is no longer going to be Christian. We are going to worship the Goddess of Reason and Truth. So they literally, they go into the cathedral, They take and steal all kinds of sacred artifacts that are in there, and they put up the statue. It's chaos.
They also crown a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral. They crown a prostitute as the goddess of reason, right? And just
I know.
the de-Christianization of France
Yeah.
is just rampant.
All, and with a lot of violence too.
Yeah, a lot of
So Napoleon, I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy necessarily, but Napoleon takes over the throne in 1796. He and Pope Pius XII sign a concordant. They sign or the seventh rather. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The seventh sign a concordant in 1801 that reestablished the Catholic Church in France. Napoleon doesn't last very long. He's overthrown.
Back up for just a sec, because Napoleon and Pope Pius VI didn't get along so well. He had Pius VI arrested and brought to France, where he died in captivity.
Right.
And Napoleon publicly called him Pius the Last. And then his successor came to the seat of the Vatican, and he took the name Pius VII. And at first they seemed to get along pretty well, but then he did something that Napoleon didn't like. Napoleon had him kidnapped, brought back to France, where he lived in captivity for 6 years until Napoleon made his last stand.
So there's obviously some bitter anti-clericalism going on, some very strong anti-church stuff. We already mentioned the United States is becoming more of a stable government. There's a peaceful transfer of power year to year, or season to season, election to election, term to term, where none of that is happening in France. It's just a hodgepodge of opposing forces just claiming power for very brief periods of time. The last remnant of the papal states in Italy, the little bit that's left, is Vatican City. And it wasn't Napoleon is the one that kind of...
No, I'm not sure why that's there.
Why is that there? Okay,
I don't know.
we don't know why that's
We'll
there.
talk about the
that
states
later.
turning to Vatican City later.
Somehow that was part of it, but not.
Yeah, but not.
So Pope Pius XII in 1814 gives permission to the Jesuits to resume their duties.
That's the seventh.
Yeah.
Pope Pius the seventh.
What did I say?
It doesn't matter, it was Rod.
Yeah.
I
There
swear.
are a lot of Piuses in this particular section of history, so,
When you have trifocals, it's hard to know which.
oh my goodness.
Which lens am I looking out of? Okay, Pius the
Seventh.
7th in 1814 gives permission for the Jesuits to come back again. So they restart the Jesuit order. And new orders begin all throughout the world, different orders, including the Marianists, the Sisters of Charity, Sisters of Loreto, the Paulists, the Salesians, Society of the Divine World. New and revitalized religious orders are once again going to be the key to renewal, just as it always has been to the church. So the church is starting to regather again, holiness coming through these religious orders, not so much through the papacy. But the papacy is getting better and stronger here.
It is.
Around this time, there's something that comes on the scene that kind of flows out of the Enlightenment that's generally called liberalism. And today we mean one thing in the United States when we talk about that, but it's a general term that was just about being in favor of changing and establishing political, constitutional, representative governments instead of monarchies. It was the idea of open dialogue, of large sums of knowledge simply for the sake of learning, like liberal education. That's what that really means, for the sake of learning itself. An endorsement of the arts, religious toleration, separation of church and state, freedom of the press, freedom of education, free market of ideas. Even though these ideas are being lived out in America for a lot of, at least it's being started, it's really kind of starting out there. Most Europeans are really skeptical because of what happened when they had the lay people had so much power in France, right? They're afraid that this is going to unravel into chaotic violence again, because that's been their experience.
Just cycles of it.
So there's kind of this weird reaction to what we would call traditional liberalism, where we're like, we're not so sure people should be free, because look what happens when they're free, right? So we kind of see where the thought comes in with that. And the church is going to have some things to say about it too. At the same time, it's unbelievable how much the world is changing in these 100 years right here.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution, everything, food preservation. Just think about that alone. being able to freeze and transport food,
Yeah.
communications, travel, mass production of goods, medical advances, all of this stuff is happening simultaneously in an unprecedented leap forward in humanity. Wealth is being created in ways that the world has never seen before, including opportunities for the very poorest to actually work their way up and own land and actually own businesses. Like, this has not happened in the history of the world. But along with the good, always comes a lot of harsh stuff. There's overcrowding. Slave and child labor is abounding because who do you have to do all this work, right? There's all kinds of abusive labor practices, poor human removal of human waste, poor removal of industrial waste, rampant disease, crime rates are soaring in the cities, and a whole lot of other issues are going on as well. So it's really good on one hand. Did I skip a slide or was that the right one?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, really good on one hand, but not everything was so beautiful.
So, in 1869, another Pius, this one the 9th.
Okay, what is that? Ninth. Okay.
1x is 9. Yeah.
Ninth.
So Pius the 9th calls a council, right? The first Vatican Council. And he calls these bishops together to talk about a couple of things, but largely the relationship between faith and reason. Remember, we're coming out of this Enlightenment period. There's a lot of stuff going on with like thought processes and how does faith and reason work together? Does it work together? And so he calls this council together to talk about this question and to talk about the primacy of the Pope once again, right? So he brings all these folks together, and he firmly believes, Pius the Ninth firmly believes in the primacy of the papacy and the infallibility of the Pope in his office when he speaks. You know, there's very specific guidelines for how the Pope is considered infallible.
What does that mean in English?
It means that when he is speaking on matters of faith, from a certain point, the church teaches that he is infallible. He cannot make a mistake, right? The Holy Spirit is guiding that and protecting that, right?
And he's the one that really clarifies it.
He's the one that clarifies it and defines it and what those parameters are, right? So he starts this council, it's 1869, and he calls it really, so if you take all those things together, he's really calling this council to counter a specific modern heresy called modernism. And modernism, we'll talk more about it later a little bit if we have time, but basically it's just this idea that
it's on here twice.
It is on here. It's on here a bunch of times.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about it later.
We'll talk about it in a minute.
He calls this council to counter modernism.
That's interesting.
Right? So the interesting thing too, he calls it in 1869, but in 1870, the council gets suspended because there's a war that breaks out, the Franco-Prussian War. When the war breaks out, the Pope suspends the council and it never comes back. They never actually officially close this council until 1960.
Oh.
They never come back to meet, but they never close it until 1960 in preparation for Vatican II, right?
Okay.
So
It's
that's
almost a 100-year council.
That's very interesting in and of itself, right? He invited, Pius IX invited the Eastern Patriarchs and Protestant leaders to come and be a part of this council. It was that important. None of them came, right?
Just like Trent.
Just like at Trent, but he did invite them. And the other thing that's interesting about this particular council, it's the first council with American bishops present.
Oh.
First
yeah,
council
yeah.
with American
I
bishops
remember that.
present,
That's right.
right?
So during the turn, as we're turning from the 1800s to the 1900s, Leo the Lion, Leo the Great, he's sometimes called, Saint Leo the 13th, right?
Yep. 13.
Saint Pope Leo the 13th sought to restore the leadership of the papacy.
Pope Saint Leo.
Pope Saint Leo. Saint Pope Leo?
Pope Saint.
Pope Saint Leo. Restore leadership to the papacy. He sought consolation with modern society and learning. He said, no, let's not be afraid of all this stuff.
Right.
Let's look at the good, look at the truth, and let's embrace it. He strove to be a friend of the democratic countries, the new governments like America. He opened the Vatican archives for study.
That's
He
huge.
took a stand on social justice and economic issues, especially defending the working folks and better working conditions.
And he issued 2 bulls on the topic of slavery, calling bishops
right.
to be against slavery and to support abolitionists.
Awesome. We're going to talk about, when we get to the saints, another guy too that had done something. And very, very briefly, he penned the St. Michael the Archangel prayer that we just talked about. At the start, right at the end of the 1800s, Pope Leo has a vision of Jesus talking with Satan. And basically Satan says, I'm going to take down your church. And Jesus says, no, you're not. And Satan says, give me a century. So Jesus says, name it. And Satan says, I want the 1900s. So in this vision, St. Leo saw Satan is given control over the next century. So he immediately comes, he was in like a trance when this happened.
Yeah.
He comes out of it, sits down at his desk, and writes the St. Michael the Archangel prayer to defend us. And for 50 years, the churches all around the world prayed that every single Mass.
Yeah.
We're doing it again now,
Mhm.
but that's the background of that. So keep that in mind as we talk about what's going to happen in the 1900s.
Mhm.
He also revived Catholic devotion to the Holy Spirit, calling the churches to observe the novena of Pentecost. Right, Pentecost, which we're going to celebrate next weekend.
Yay.
In these early years of the 1900s, there's something that comes on the scene a little bit that's called secular humanism. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later when we talk about all of the schism stuff. Sort of a product of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment, and it's not very good for the most part in general. But during this time also, 2 world wars are brewing. More people are killed in those 50 years, or more people are killed in the 50 years of that war period than died in all the previous wars of human history combined. Satan has this century. Did you want to, well, we'll talk about
that in a little bit
later.
Yep.
In 1859, so now we're kind of backtracking a wee bit because
No reason. We just
yeah, it's just the way it laid out because Pope Leo was a little bit later. But Charles Darwin publishes his Origin of Species, where he argues his theory of evolution in 1859. The theory was adopted and applied to most branches of the sciences. Those of us that are in a lot of these different areas of study, psychology, humanities, history, philosophy, even theology kind of adopted the idea that things evolve over time, that things didn't just pop into being. There's this evolution, and there's a lot of truth to it. The church, especially some writings of Pope St. John Paul II, does not formally endorse and does not formally deny the idea of evolution as a process, but the church does deny removing God as the creator.
Right. So Darwinism, as in the theory of Darwin for evolution, we do not believe, right?
Because
he removes God as creator. Right?
It's accidental.
It's accidental, yeah, like
mistake.
yeah, the
mistake.
descent from apes kind of thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, just accidental mutations that finally turn into man. We don't believe in that, but a theory of evolution as a process in the development of humanity created by God,
Maybe.
Maybe. The church
Maybe.
says you're free to believe that.
And so John Paul had written a really great, and said some great statements about this in his pontificate. And I still remember the headline in Time magazine was, Pope vindicates Darwin. And it's like, well, kind of not really.
No.
That's not really what he said.
No.
So could God have used evolution as a process? Maybe. The church says we don't know for sure. But natural selection accidentally creating life with no design, no purpose, no plan,
No way.
we don't believe that at all. So this is a part of the secular humanism idea though too. Pope Benedict XV, I got that one
Good
right,
job.
right? Who died in 1922, he maintained strict neutrality during World War I.
Yeah.
And a remarkable event happened during his pontificate when he was Pope. In 1917, Mary, the Mother of God, Remember him?
Her.
Her.
Mary
Mary,
is a
mother
her.
of, well, I meant Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Oh,
Mother,
okay.
right.
That's
Anyway, remember him, Jesus. Okay.
Gotcha.
Got me? So, Mary, the mother of God, appears to 3 little children in Fatima, Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
And what's called? Our Lady of Fatima.
Lady of Fatima.
Because it
Or
happens
the
in Fatima,
miracle of
Portugal.
Fatima. Vision of Fatima.
And she predicts the end of World War I. She warns that the errors of Russia will be spread throughout the world, which is really interesting because what we're going to talk about in a minute. And then a miraculous event happened that you can look online and see newspaper things to this day. Tens of thousands of onlookers witnessed the sun appearing to whirl and dance in the sky. The miracle of the sun, which happened in
17.
Oh, was that the same year?
1917,
Okay.
it's October.
Okay. Unbelievable event seen by tens of thousands of people all over the world. There's all kinds of articles written about it. But what's amazing, I didn't know this till just like maybe last year was the first time I heard this. Mary says, if Russia is not consecrated to my Sacred Heart, and if people don't turn back to Jesus, the errors of Russia are going to spread throughout the world. Well, at this point, Russia was not spreading errors yet. Immediately after these images, Lenin and the Bolshevik Party took power in Russia, and the communist rule began in Russia, the communist takeover. It hadn't even begun when she revealed this to these 3 little kids.
I'd have to look up dates because the Bolshevik Revolution.
It was
when
right
they,
then.
When they overthrew Tsar Nicholas, that was in October of 1917.
It's like right while it's happening.
Well.
It's unbelievable.
So that's pretty wild. That's pretty wild.
Uh-huh.
Isn't it interesting that in the trance of the Pope, God said Satan could have the 1900s, but Mary,
Yes.
it's like,
She's not
he
letting.
didn't say Mary couldn't do it.
Right, exactly.
That's right.
So,
She always fights back, doesn't she? She
He does.
so even if that vision of Leo was totally correct, if Satan really had control, like it doesn't mean he's running free reign. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Because we're also going to see some of the biggest movements of God in this century too.
I want to say something else about Benedict XV before we move on. Just one little thing. His idea or his concept of political neutrality throughout World War I, he did loads of stuff you can read about, like for both sides, right? Like supporting the needy and humanitarian efforts during the war. But one of the big things that I read that made such an impression on me, he gave so much money in financial assistance to everyone who needed it during World War I, that when he died, there was not enough money in the Vatican treasury to pay for his funeral. He had given it all away.
Wow.
To help the people
I'd
hurt by
never
the
heard
war.
that.
Yeah, help the people hurt by the war. He gave away so much money they couldn't pay for his funeral. Isn't that wild? I love that.
Now, we don't want to go into a political theory or anything, but
We should not.
just as so we understand the church's standpoint, communism is an atheistic political philosophy developed by Karl Marx, and the initial idea is that there's an overthrowing basically of capitalist governments by the working class. Okay, common ownership of goods and services. Okay, sounds okay, but in practice, it always devolves into dictatorships ruled by a few, with the common people in most cases starving to death by the tens of thousands. And so the church strongly denounces communism. It didn't at first because we weren't really sure. We weren't really sure what was going on. And also Karl Marx rejects all religion as the opiate of the masses.
Yes.
Part of communism and part of Marxism is the belief that there is no God.
Right.
And we need to wipe that off the face of the earth in order to let this happen. So the church at first was a little squishy. We're not sure what we think about it. When they see it starting to play out, though, they're going to get really strongly against it. Pope Pius XI faces the challenge of 2 dangerous ideologies that flow out of Marxism: fascism and Nazism. Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler are coming to power. Mussolini signs a treaty with Pope Pius XI, which brought temporary peace between the government and the church.
And that is the establishment of Vatican City and the final doing away with the
Oh,
papal
yeah.
states. So Italy becomes a united country. The land of Italy becomes united as a nation for the first time in the end of the 19th century, so the late 1800s, right? And when Italy becomes this unified nation, there's kind of this tension between Italy, the country, and the papal states, because Italy wants to absorb that land, and the Pope is like, no, that's our land. And so they're kind of this pushback between the two of them. So it's kind of this very uneasy, uncomfortable, awkward relationship between the papal states and Italy until 1929, Mussolini and Pope Pius XI come to this agreement by which the Vatican city-state is established. It's just over 100 acres of land, and the rest of the papal state land is absorbed into Italy. Right?
So that's where that fits.
That's where it fits.
He also signs a peace treaty with Hitler, but before the ink is even dry, like literally everything I looked at said that.
Yeah,
Before the ink was even dry,
it was like 5 days after they signed the
he
treaty.
began to repress the Catholic Church and
Yeah.
immediately started. That's when all of Hitler's stuff started really ugly.
And you know where he started first? Attacking the family. The very first thing Hitler did 5 days after signing this treaty was put sterilization laws into effect and allow for the civil divorce of people based on one of them being anti-Nazi or having anti-Nazi beliefs, right? So the very first thing Hitler did 5 days after signing this treaty with Pius XI was begin to attack the family.
One of the other things, and this is a big thing I love about Pius XI, he institutes the Feast of Christ the King.
Yeah.
Because he sees what's going on, not only what's going on in his time frame with all these leaders, but what's gone on throughout the history of Europe.
Right.
And he says, enough of this. Christ is the King. So Christ the King is now the feast that kind of kicks off Advent every year. It's the very last.
Well, it doesn't kick off Advent. It ends the liturgical
year. It ends the
year.
liturgical year.
Yeah.
And then Advent begins
right
afterwards. So during this time also, so as Hitler is taking on power, all this stuff is going on. During this time in Spain, there's a huge war. Russia and Mexico are both experiencing huge anti-Catholic pushback. Mexico around 1910 has started imprisoning and killing priests by the tens of thousands of people. People are murdered while they're going into or out of mass. Like horrible things are going on in Mexico. In the 1910s, I think it spilled over into the 1920s. So there's all kinds of chaos going on around the world at this point. All kinds of chaos in the 1900s.
Yes.
Then Pius XII.
But before, you're going to jump like past World War II here, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Well,
it's not a history class, it's a history class.
But World War II, Pius XII did some pretty cool stuff, right?
Well, we're going to talk about him.
I know, but you're starting in 58.
Oh, well, yeah, why does that start in 58?
Because you don't have anything on here. So.
Oh, he died in 58. That's supposed to be died in. That's supposed to be died. Because, like, 58, the word's long over.
I know.
Okay. Big typo problem there. Sorry.
Sorry.
He dies in 1958. So, okay.
But Pius XII, during World War II, right? He, again, like his predecessor, adopted this policy of absolute neutrality. He was all about ending the war peacefully, trying to get diplomatic discussions going, helping in humanitarian efforts for anyone and everyone. But one of the big things he did, he was very pro helping the Jews, which is pretty amazing, right? So one of the things he did was in 1939, at the outset of the war, he sent letters secretly to the nuncios of Poland and Turkey. The nuncio is kind of like the ambassador. So the ambassador from the Vatican to a country is called the nuncio. So he sent letters to the nuncios of Poland and Turkey, telling them secretly to create false baptismal documents for Jews so that they could leave the country. Because if you were baptized, you weren't Jewish. You could leave, right?
Yeah.
So create false baptismal documents for these Jews so they can get out of your country.
They think that alone saved thousands.
Thousands of lives. Isn't that amazing? He was so, like, there's tons of stuff we could talk about that he did for the Jewish population of Europe. But he was so instrumental in saving and rescuing as many Jews as he could, that when the war ended, the chief rabbi of the city of Rome, a man named Isaac Zoli, converted to Catholicism.
The chief rabbi.
The chief rabbi of Rome converted to Catholicism because of the love he saw in Pius XII. Like, that is an amazing example. Just so cool. He did great stuff.
I haven't often choked up during this series because we did, but that really gets me.
I know, it's amazing.
That's awesome. He firmly believed that the greatest threat to humanity was communism, probably because of what came out of Our Lady of Fatima, that the evils and the wickedness of Russia were going to be spread throughout the world. He aligned the church more and more with Western democracies, more with the idea of democracies. Yeah, it says that right there. And then he does one of the most important things for those of us that really love Mary. In 1950, he is the Pope that declared finally and definitively the doctrine that Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven. A feast day that had been already celebrated for 1,500 years in the church.
Right.
It was a belief that had been held since the 2nd century, as far as we know.
At least.
We can find record of it.
Yeah.
The idea that Mary herself was taken body and soul into heaven.
And by the way, this is one of the very few teachings that is considered infallible from the Pope, right? There's only a couple of things that the Pope has done infallibly, and this is one of them.
And the other one was the Immaculate Conception,
Immaculate
which
Conception.
we'll talk about here in a little bit.
Yep.
In the same era too. And one of the reasons he does this is because 1950 is at the end of all these horrible wars. Well, not all of them, but
Right.
World War I and World War II.
Right.
Humanity has seen nothing but the worst of what other humans can do. And he said, it's time that we raise up a figure. We raise up somebody to give us something to look forward to. And who better than Mary, who was assumed body and soul because she was so perfectly awesome.
So perfectly perfect.
She's just so perfect. She's so awesome that she is the greatest role model.
Yeah.
So he did that very deliberately after one of the darkest times in world history. He also opened up the fields of biblical and historical scholarship, trying not to be so like anti-science sort of things, which we'll talk about, or anti-modern, which we'll talk about here in a minute.
Yeah, he wrote over 40 encyclicals, which is amazing.
I did not know that.
Over 40 encyclicals on everything from evolution to Bible study, right? And everything you can think of in between. So he was really a big part of how and why we teach the way we, not what we teach, but the way we teach today in the church. And calling people to study scripture and that sort of thing really comes from him.
Our very last stop, although we shouldn't end here, there's so many things, but this is where we're going to stop along this time, at least for this period of the, what do we call this? The situations. Vatican II, the Great Vatican II Council, called by Saint Pope John the 23rd. It was a great renewal, a great updating of the church. It was not just, I've got something over the, not just sterile academic controversies. So it's not just a lot of academics talk, right?
No.
He really wanted a meaningful, positive, fresh way of restating the church's teachings for the people in a way that really impacted people for real, not just theory.
Vatican II is not unique, but unusual because it's uncommon. Vatican II is special in this way. It's considered a teaching council, right? So it's really about how we teach who we are and in the modern world, right? It was not called against a heresy, which that is very unusual. Most councils are called to combat a heresy or to further explain a doctrine or dogma of the church. Vatican II is neither of those things, although it does touch on a little bit of them. It's really called to be a teaching council.
Todd? So, John the 23rd, he called the council, but then he got cancer.
Right.
Yeah.
And he died.
Right.
Yep.
And fortunately, Pope
Paul VI.
had a choice.
Yep.
And he took it up. And all of our popes, except Francis, were involved in Vatican II.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes.
Since then.
Yep. All the popes since, except for until Francis, all of them were either writers of the documents or they were somehow involved. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and it was great. He wanted to open the door to let in fresh air. That's what he said. Those were his words. He called for.
I have something to say. He invited the Eastern Orthodox patriarchs, and he invited Protestant leaders, and guess what? They came.
Yeah.
They actually came. There were Eastern patriarchs present. There were Orthodox present. There were Protestant leaders present, all there to observe and see what's going on and be a part of. They didn't have like a vote or anything like that, but to be a part of this Vatican. And guess what else, ladies? He invited women. First time ever there were women present at a council.
I reject this notion. That's awesome.
Yeah. Talk about letting in some fresh air, right?
So he calls for, in the Mass, remember the Mass has not changed since the Council of Trent, right? So things have been going the same for about 500 years. And he said, well, at this point, 400 years. And he says, you know, it's time that the people have an active participation in Mass. We need to be actively engaged. He restored the deacons. The deacons had been lost in the history of the church. We didn't have diaconate, the deacons, for centuries. He brought back the idea of permanent deacons. He brought back the rite of Christian initiation for adults. The RCIA had been lost for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. We hadn't done it. There was no formal process. He just kind of met with Father and he did whatever he wanted to do. So there's actually like a process there. He called for the holiness of all lay people, not just the priests and the sisters, right? He talked about how the church engages the modern world. He talks about how the church is supposed to be on mission to go out to other people. Some say that when John the 23rd opened the window to let in fresh air, a lot of other really bad things came in with it once the window was open. That's what a lot of people have said about it. And it is. There's a lot of chaos that comes shortly after. But John warned against these prophets of gloom. He was also very aware there was like this false spirit that violated what Vatican II was actually about. Bishop Barron has an amazing book that we'll probably do a study on somehow, somewhere in the future. An amazing book on Vatican II from Bishop Barron, where he has this great commentary on it. And he says there were those that talked about the spirit of Vatican II, as in like they want to dismantle everything that the church, what we would say hold dear, you know. They wanted to dismantle a lot of the just the great teachings, the mystery, and the.
Clearly, those folks have not read the document.
Yeah, and it's like, no, that's not what it's about at all. No. It's about going back to the roots, to the very beginning, and just reintroducing it into the modern era. That's really what it's about. There were a lot of problems that came after Vatican II, but a lot of that was caused by just increasing craziness in the world, not because of the council. Yeah, and a ton of that.
I would say, so Vatican II produced 16 documents, and of those, 4 of them are dogmatic constitutions that are kind of seen as the pillars or the foundations of the council. And if you don't read anything else, read those 4 documents sometime. They're
really
not
good.
They're so good. Especially Lumen Gentium. Oh my gosh, if that's the only thing you pick up and read Lumen Gentium. That's the Latin title for it, right? Lumen Gentium.
The light of the Gentiles, light of the world.
Yeah,
right?
but that's not the English title. The English
Something
title is
like
like the Congregation for the People, or I don't
blah,
remember.
blah, blah.
Lumen Gentium. Way better title. Right? Pick it up and read it. It's free online. It's so good, and it really explains our call to holiness as lay people, and what we're supposed to be sent on mission for, right? And Vatican II was really well implemented in some places.
Right.
Africa and Asia did a great job of implementing the vision of Vatican II and those documents. Not so much in Europe and in the West.
Yeah. There's a lot of confusion even among the bishops about what are we supposed to do now?
Yeah.
What's this and that? And a lot of folks in our congregation have stories because a lot of you were around then. And you come to Mass one Sunday and you're doing Mass like this, you go the next week and everything's different. And they're like, nobody told us what was going on. They didn't do a really good job explaining, or even to the priests sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's what we're living in now, is this time of like unpacking that.
Post-conciliar age.
Yeah. So, saints and sinners, oh my gosh, you'll be so upset with me by the time we're done because we left out so many of the big ones, but there just isn't time. Saint John Vianney. John was a wonderful priest in France, a town called Ars, so he's called the priest or the cure of Ars. If you've ever heard that before, it just means the priest of the town of Ars.
I think Father mentioned him in his homily last week, and he called him the cure of Ars, and I thought, not sure how many people get that title,
Yeah.
but I'm glad you used it.
No pirates. He really truly had the heart of Christ. He would spend, the legends are, he would spend 16 hours a day, sometimes in the confessional, hearing the prayers of the
hearing
people.
confessions.
Yeah, not by himself. Not by
Hearing
himself.
confessions.
So we're looking at a couple of the saints. We're going to go back to, we mentioned just very briefly, I think, Pope Gregory the 16th.
Good job.
Right? Who died in 1846, but we're going to talk about him a little bit more. He firmly condemned the political liberalism that he saw going on, that was coming out of Europe, out of the Enlightenment, that the whole idea of freedom and stuff. He did not like this. He saw it as a front, a fake for the violence that was happening in France. And he really wanted to hold to the idea that religion, the religion of Christianity is the greatest, and it's not like one religion is the same as all the others, which was something that was kind of coming out of liberalism. He was greatly disliked by the time he died. People didn't like Pope Gregory very well. He saw the role of the church and the government, that they need to work together to oppress the immorality and the false truths that were kind of cropping up everywhere. He supported the idea of sovereign monarchies, of kings and queens, because relatively they were stable compared to the revolutions that he was seeing. Now, really, they were stable? When you look back at the history that we just went through the last couple of weeks. In theory. But in theory, he was very wary of this idea of this freedom movement, this liberalism. He did not like it. So he very much supported the old school of monarchies. He opposed married clergy. He thought it was very important that the priests remain unmarried. He stood firm against divorce and adultery and all kinds of things that were just really popular in Europe at the time. He stood against. But here's what I remember.
Popular in Europe at the time makes me laugh. Go on.
Yeah, well, popular in Europe at the time and everywhere else now.
Exactly.
Who are we talking about? Gregory, right?
Yes, Gregory.
He is often mocked for his paranoia, and I remember specifically hearing about this a long time ago. He was opposed to new technology like the railway system, like trains. He thought that was a little too crazy and over the top. He didn't like gaslit lamps, especially out in public, like on lampstands outside, street lamps and things. He didn't like that because it might kind of promote the idea that the common man could gather under the street lamps to plot against the monarchs, right? So he kind of he's a little paranoid. He didn't like the idea of free press. He didn't like the idea of people having a free conscience to make up their minds. He thought people had to be told, because he just mistrusted people because of what he saw.
He sounds Marxist.
I know, isn't it kind of funny the way things go both ways? He sounds, a little controlling, but it's also because of the world that he was living in. He's watching the chaos unravel in France and everywhere. But with all that kind of bad stuff, he was a really strong supporter of the arts. He created all kinds of new museums, some of the ones that you can go to today in Europe. He solidly supported the Catholic Church growth in America. He advocated for clergy to be native to their own nation. So don't send Irish priests over to America. There need to be American priests in America. Irish priests, you stay in Ireland, because he just thought that made the most sense, that he should be native. He also, this is what I like about him, he wrote a very firm apostolic letter in 1839 condemning the transatlantic slave trade. He was appalled that human beings were being treated as animals. And he said, why today do I get all emotional and not all the other?
I have a theory, but I'll say it later.
Because we're done. He said it was absolutely unworthy of the name of Christ. right?
And he was not wrong.
It's a great letter. If you get a chance, and are in your spare time, if you get a chance to read this letter, it is beautifully written. It's really great. So I didn't like him going into this. After reading that, I'm like, I really like Pope Gregory. I like him. He's a man of his time.
Yeah, he's a man of his time.
He's a
And
man of
like
his
everybody, he's got pros and cons, right?
Yeah.
But if you're going to have a pro on your side, that's a good one to have, right? That's a good one to have.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Human
It's human trafficking. It is.
Change names doesn't change the meaning.
Pope Pius IX had the longest rule of any pope in history.
Except Peter.
Except Peter?
Mhm.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Peter reigned longer? Really?
Yes.
Okay. I'll take your word at it. Perhaps his greatest achievement was to deepen and renew the spiritual life of just everyday Catholics. He's the one that encouraged frequent reception of the sacraments, devotion to Mary, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. He's the one that really promoted the idea of the Sacred Heart, and the whole centrality that Jesus is in the center of every single thing that we teach. The Jesuits doubled their membership during this time. So the Jesuits had gone away. They came back. Pius IX really, really supported them. They doubled their membership. He's the one, so this is the other doctrine that gets stated by a pope infallibly. The pope says, this is what we believe. I state it from the chair of Peter, and you've got to believe it. The one was the Assumption that happened in 1950. This one happened in 1854. He said, we are to believe that Mary was conceived without sin, the Immaculate Conception. Jesus saved her, right? Jesus saved her, but he saved her before she was born.
Yeah.
Right?
So, and this infallible statement from the Pope comes out before the Vatican I Council, which was partially called, one of its tasks was to define and outline the infallibility of the Pope, right? So a response to him making this statement infallibly was, we're not so sure about that infallibility thing. We need to talk about it, right? And so they gather and they decide, yeah, he's right. There is infallibility when these certain things are done and met this way. We can approve and believe in the infallibility of the Pope in certain things.
And what's utterly amazing is about 4 years after he declares this, there's a young lady, Saint Bernadette in Lourdes, France. This young lady, it's a beautiful story. Mary appears to her, and Mary says to her, I am the Immaculate Conception. Now here's this young farm girl from France who has no idea what that term means. This is a theological term that means nothing to her. It's not like they wrote books about it that went out to the French countryside, right? They were still arguing about it among the theologians. And Mary tells her, I am the Immaculate Conception. When she goes and the word gets to the local bishop, what she was told, the bishop flips out. He's like, how in the world would a little girl in France have heard this before? It must be miraculous, right? So it was kind of this really neat confirmation that maybe the Pope was right on that one.
A funny thing about Pius IX, so Todd mentioned Gregory the 16th and his quirks, one of them being he wasn't real fond of the modern tech like railway systems and gas lighting in the streets, right? Pius IX comes into the papacy after Gregory the 16th. First thing he does, gas lights in the streets of Rome, and let's set up a commission to figure out how to get a railway system.
It's like totally opposite.
I know, I love it.
Okay. So we're not even going to talk about in the United States these great saints like St. John Henry Newman, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, St. Francis Cabrini, St. Dorothy Day, the Native American Kateri Tekakwitha. I don't know how.
That K shouldn't be there.
I don't know how you say it.
It's Tekakwitha.
Tekakwitha?
Saint Kateri Tekakwitha.
Saint Kateri. Okay. Father Tom Neno's favorite saint. And there's all kinds of European ones that we just don't have time. I want to mention this one though, Saint Faustina Kowalska, or in America we'd say Kowalski. So any Kowalskis we know are from this family. A Polish nun who had really deep encounters with Jesus in prayer. She compiled these conversations in her diaries. Jesus basically talks to her and gives her the prayers that we know of as the Divine Mercy. So the Divine Mercy prayers. It was just in 1930s, I think, when her stuff started to get published. Also during the time of all this upheaval, starting World War II's beginning, all in that era, coming out of World War I, right? This terrible stuff's going on, and here's another great saint that Jesus is going to raise up against this reign of Satan.
Rising up in Poland.
In Poland.
Where, communism's going to be a stronghold and Hitler's going to overtake. And I mean, like, really, like, God is just amazing the way he uses people and places and times, right?
Underscores. And another thing about Faustina, we mentioned last week, I think, about the Jansenists, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. The Jansenists is kind of this ugly spot, and it is a French idea that nobody's good enough to be saved. Nobody's good enough for Jesus. You can't go to communion because you're not good enough. Ugly, mean pictures of Jesus, like frowning. It was just a very dark, dour kind of thing. And this is raised up in exact defense of that, or against that rather, that Jesus is saying, no, I am merciful. I am kind. I'm loving. I'm not dour like that. So St. Pope Pius X, he called for religious education of youth, young people, in the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, also known as CCD. So those of us that did not go to Catholic school, maybe we went to CCD class, and we still call it that. Some people do.
Some people do, but not as much.
It's really like a technical, it's like a specific thing that you teach.
Right.
But they just kind of call religious education or anything for the public school kids. They call it that sometimes.
Some people still do.
He's the one that just kind of said, we really need this for those that are not involved with Catholic education, Catholic schools. He's the one that moves the age for First Eucharist. Oops, I never did change that. First Eucharist to around 7. Scratch off reconciliation.
You can scratch off the word reconciliation in that slide.
I thought I did that, but I guess I didn't. He moved the age for First Eucharist to around age 7, the age of reason. Because before that, what was happening?
Well, before that, the age for Eucharist came after confirmation, right? And so usually for most folks, they would get confirmed, they would receive reconciliation, then they would get confirmed, and then they would receive Eucharist. And usually confirmation and Eucharist were around, 13-ish, give or take.
Between 4th and 8th grade, usually.
Yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Point, somewhere in there.
But, the problem is, well, not the problem so much, but Pius X's vision of people need grace and they need it younger, right? And he wanted them to have the grace of the sacrament. And so, he moved that age younger. And there's a story of a little girl too who was deathly ill, who wanted so badly to receive Jesus, but because of her age, she couldn't yet. She had written a letter to the Pope, and he was very moved by that. And so he wanted children to be able to receive Christ in the Eucharist.
Awesome.
So he moved that age.
And he also really endorsed the idea that we should receive every week if you're in a state of grace.
Yeah.
Where a lot of people weren't doing that.
Right, because they had bought into that Jansenist thought that you're not worthy, right? You're not worthy to receive Christ in the Eucharist. And so they'll go to Mass, but they're not going up for communion. That got to be a real problem in the very early 20th century, late 1800s, early 1900s. Big problem with people not going to communion. So he wanted to encourage folks to go to communion at least weekly. And in fact, that's why we have a rule in the church now that you have to receive the Eucharist at least once a year, preferably during the Easter season, right? Because people just wouldn't go because they didn't feel worthy.
So he really buoyed up like just the average Catholic's kind of sense of spirituality in a great way. He really disliked, there's this movement called modernism, which we'll talk about again later. And it doesn't mean like against modern technology. It's a specific thing against a modernistic approach to Bible study. And theology. Modernism is more of a theological thing. So it doesn't mean like sweepingly he's against, modern computer age.
He's not against gas lights and railways.
No, he's not against any of that. So it's a specific thing about an approach to the Bible where the scholars, it was a lot of it coming out of Germany and France again, always Germany and France.
Imagine that.
Coming out of a lot of their scholars, where they basically wanted to strip all the supernatural away, saying Jesus didn't really perform miracles. All the miracles that happened in the Old Testament, they could all be explained by science and that kind of thing. Taking away, and then when you start taking away the miracles, you take away the resurrection. And St. Paul says, without the resurrection, we have no faith.
Well, and you take away the power of God,
Yeah,
right? Like,
exactly.
where's the hope for me to be saved if God has no power, right?
Yeah. He gets accused of he overreacted. He's like, no, you shall not study the Bible at all. I mean, he was really kind of heavy-handed about that to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe he did stifle some research, but I think in a way he was also being very wise in making sure that the Catholic approach to the Bible is filled with faith and miracles.
Mm-hmm.
We believe in the miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as they're in order, Pope Benedict is going to write later on, it's fine to have those studies, but have it under faith. Faith comes first, right? The idea that faith and the way that we talk about seeing it with sacramental eyes,
Mm-hmm.
seeing the world through the eyes of like the miraculous. Pope John the 23rd, so he's the one that becomes Pope in 1958. He dies in 1963. He's the one that starts up the Vatican II Council. I was a brand new Catholic working at one of the local churches, and I just remember the staff, the people on staff there, just glowing when they talked about Pope John the 23rd. They loved this guy. They really just found him delightful.
He was jolly looking.
Yeah,
You know?
he was the really thin. Wasn't he the really thin?
Oh, he was big.
Oh, he was the big guy. Oh, yeah. He was the big round guy. Okay, I always get the two confused.
Santa Clausy.
Pope Paul was the really thin guy, the little wiry guy. Okay, yeah. So he was the big jolly guy. Yeah, okay. That's what. And we were gonna do pictures, but oh my gosh, we'd spend hours doing that. We did that with. So he was so well known as the people's pope. He was known for walking through the streets of Rome. Oh, his security detail hated him because he would just go out and not tell anybody he's out in the public. He's visiting hospitals and prisons. Security
details weren't quite the way they are today.
No, they weren't as all the assassinations weren't happening like happened in the 60s. He was there's all kinds of stories of him just going up to people and telling jokes and telling these long stories. And he's the one that started Vatican II.
Yep.
He wanted to renew the wonders of our time as though for a new Pentecost. And he knew about Pope Leo's vision. And he wanted to end that century with something really positive, something really good, because he knew about that vision about Satan. Pope Paul VI, then, he takes over. Pope John dies before the council is finished.
Mm-hmm.
Pope Paul VI, he dies in 1978. Oh my gosh, we're getting into time that I remember.
I don't.
Yeah. He realized this was not a new Catholic Church. It's just a step forward, right? We weren't trying to recreate things. We wanted to step forward with an eye back to the foundations. That's really what it was about. He addressed the United Nations for the first time. He called very clearly for an end to war. He traveled to the Holy Land. He traveled to national disaster sites. He went to the sacred sites at Fatima, in Ephesus. He tried to celebrate Mass at Ephesus. That's where St. John the Evangelist ended up going. At that point, it's all taken over by Muslims. They would not allow him to celebrate a Mass there. He was the Pope, and they wouldn't allow him because the church was totally disbanded there. But he went there anyway. He just couldn't celebrate Mass. He made the College of Cardinals more international. He brought in cardinals from Africa, Asia, and the New World. It's still, the New World.
Still the New World of the church.
And their point of view.
Only existed for 10% of the time of the church.
He added the first religious women in history to basically, the Roman Curia is like the bishop's staff office, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like the office. So first time ever, women are allowed into that. They had to have new bathrooms, I bet.
I bet they did.
That's a whole modern thing, right?
It's a whole different conversation.
He wrote an amazing encyclical on evangelization that I love, that Pope John Paul just kind of stole. When John Paul II comes on the scene, he just kind of steals some of his ideas. Pope Paul VI was cool with the new evangelization before it was cool to be cool.
New evangelization.
With the new evangelization. He's the one that started it. but he caused a lot of controversy.
Yes.
For people that don't like the church, they didn't like him. He caused a lot of controversy by really sticking to a traditional view of love and marriage and really supporting the Catholic teaching on birth control. And the thought was he was going to move that discussion and move that football down the field to somewhere else. And in the end, he said, no, I think that's the right teaching. Oh, he was really hated by a lot of people because of that. But then Pope St. John Paul comes on the scene, and John Paul totally ran with this idea too.
Yes.
So John Paul II dies in 2005. He was the first pope from a communist-dominated nation. He was at Vatican II, and he wrote many of, at least parts of several of those documents in the Vatican II documents. He was a first-rate philosopher. He wanted nothing more than to implement the Second Vatican Council throughout the world. That's what he wanted to do. All these ideas that came up then, that's what needs to happen. He's the one that authorizes the Catechism of the Catholic Church, a little book that we've got, that the summary of all of our teachings. He wrote 14 encyclicals, brought about the devotion to divine mercy. He's the one that like introduced the world to Saint Faustina and the whole divine mercy, and he ends up making it a holy day.
Yep.
And it's just awesome, his work with that. You know, he has the great part along with the politicians of that age and the downfall of the Soviet Union. He brings about a whole lot of discussion with interfaith, with Eastern Orthodox, with Lutherans, all kinds of great stuff. And he begins World Youth Days too, gathering of the biggest one. Was Rio de Janeiro the big one where there was like 2.5 million teenagers? I think
You
it
mean
was.
the one that just happened, Rio?
Was it Rio? No, that wasn't him then. That would have been Pope.
It was Francis. That was
Francis.
just at Rio.
It was one of the ones that John Paul did. It was like 2.5 million young people that gathered. It's the largest gathering of humanity in one spot
I feel like it was Denver.
for an event. Was it Denver?
I feel like it was Denver.
Was it? I
You think so too?
I just remember hearing it was the largest gathering of humanity in one spot for one event.
He couldn't land his
Right.
helicopter
Yeah.
because the noise of the crowd, the sound waves of the crowd buffeted the helicopter.
The
And they
sound
had-
wave.
And they had to have the crowd quiet down so that they could come in.
Isn't that
Isn't that
crazy?
wild? That's how many
Yeah.
people were there. That to me is just mind blowing.
They say he was seen by more people directly with their own eyes than any other human being that walked the earth,
Yep.
because he traveled so much and did so many of these huge events like that. I mean, millions of people. He's the one that coins the term the new evangelization.
That we've heard so much about the
That
guest
we're
speakers.
gonna reach out into this culture.
Before you do that.
Todd, I
Sure.
just, before you move on, I
Sure.
just want to point out that between Pope Paul VI and John Paul II, there was John Paul
the
I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was only alive for a month.
He
Yeah,
was in there
he was
for,
only a pope for a month.
Yeah.
was it 30 days? Yeah.
Yep.
He
Yeah.
didn't even really do anything.
No.
How did he die? So Pope John Paul I, how did
Right.
he, does anyone
You know, I
remember?
don't know how he died.
Some medical issue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't remember. It was very abrupt,
Yeah.
obviously.
Obviously, yeah.
Obviously.
Before you move on, before we move out of the saints and sinners category, I just want to call your mind to that whole 20th century time frame again, and think about this for a moment. Okay? In the course of the 20th century, that 100-year time span, there were more martyrs for the Christian faith than in double the number of the 19th centuries previously combined. So in 1900 years, the martyrs for the Christian faith, double that number, and we had that many martyrs just in the 20th century, right?
A lot connected to World War I and World War II.
Well,
but
yeah,
not-
World War
not
I and
only-
World War II, but just
Right.
mass genocides of
Right.
Christianity, Uganda,
Mhm.
Congo, right? Like loads of nations who just want to wipe out Christians. And it's not just Catholics, but we make up a good chunk of them,
Mhm.
right? Just insane numbers of people killed
Death.
killed for their faith,
Mhm.
for their Christian faith.
I don't know how we're going to do this.
We'll do it.
Schisms.
We just won't talk about any of
We
them.
mentioned modernism a wee bit. It's an approach where it's mostly it was a Protestant kind of thing to strip away the supernatural.
If you've ever been to Mass and heard a homily on the feeding of the 5,000 that went something along the lines of, the miracle of feeding of the 5,000 was that people brought food with them and they shared it, right? They were generous and they shared food with their neighbor who didn't bring any. If you've ever
That's
heard
modernism.
that homily, that's modernism.
Jesus walked in the water because it was frozen.
Yeah.
Literally, I've heard that homily.
I've heard that
before.
one too. The waters
So-
of the Red Sea parting was a natural phenomenon that happened every so often when the wind would blow a certain way through the valley, right? And it would naturally just blow the water apart. No.
So the reason it's so dangerous, I guess, is because it removes the supernatural, and then you remove the supernatural from Jesus. Jesus is supernatural. I mean, that's what our faith is built on.
If you take that away, he's just a man, and he can't save you if he's just a man.
And again, not that we can't talk about those things and look at maybe that's how God did it, but to kind of paint it that way with the whole worldview, that's modernism. Right? And again, it's not against modern society, it's specifically Bible.
Right.
So, while not officially a schism, the sexual abuse of minors by clergy in the last century, and it spilled into this century even, just an unholy tear within the body of Christ. Unbelievable. I cannot get my head around the numbers. One of our good priests several years ago was talking, I was like, how could this happen? And he goes, you just as a priest, you cannot believe your brothers would do something like this. So you're in total shock. You're like, there's no way they did that. And he goes, I cannot get my head around the fact that my brothers would do this kind of thing. The accusations began publicly in the late 1980s. They had been going on for, centuries, I'm sure.
Forever. Yeah.
But this is when it really got huge. Cases, decades and decades of abuse. And it wasn't just the United States. Canada, Chile, Australia, Ireland. I remember hearing lots of stuff out of Ireland. Much of Europe, the same things were going on. It was just a worldwide pattern of long-term abuse and cover up. Do you think maybe the hand of Satan is involved with this, right? It is the most, what could be more wicked and evil?
Not only in the act itself, but in its portrayal to the public.
Yeah.
Right? Like
And
what better way to get people to doubt their faith
Right.
than to cover this sort of stuff up as a church, as a whole, cover it up, and then splash it on the front page of every newspaper for 30 years.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, you think your church is a good, holy, preserved place? Guess what? Right? This is an attack beyond all attacks. Not the act itself is horrible and not forgivable, right? But the way it's covered up and the way it's portrayed does even more damage, right?
John Paul II apologized. Pope Benedict XVI apologized. Pope Francis apologized. Francis made huge sweeping changes. It has affected us that work in the church or anyone that's volunteers immensely, the stuff that we've got to go through. And it kind of makes you angry in a way because it's like, we're not the ones that did this. But it's the way it is. But horrible rift in the church. Who knows how many millions of people left Catholicism over that. It's one of the biggest things that when I talk to people.
Yeah, for sure.
These things, again, are not direct schisms necessarily. Some of them have been called out as flat out heresies. But just looking at our culture today, when we talk about humanism, these are all like part of that. And you've probably heard these words before: hedonism, relativism, individualism, scientism. That's our new one right now, scientism. Hedonism is very American. I want comfort. I don't want to suffer. I want ease. I want pleasure. Anything that's going to make me uncomfortable. The idea of dying and suffering, like, no way, I don't want that at all.
Right.
It's hedonism, right? I want what's easy and what's comfortable. And when that dominates to a world when we believe actually suffering can be redemptive, it can be saving. Like you've got to go through the cross. Like suffering is part of the story. The world doesn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
Right? Relativism. Oh, that's a fun one. There's no ultimate truth. Your truth is not the same as my truth.
Yeah.
Truth is subjective to your situation.
You do you, man.
We see this everywhere. Individualism is totally tied to that. I'm self-reliant. It's about, I pull myself up with my bootstraps. I don't need a savior. I just need me. Self-truth. You know, it's very much like relativism. It's very much tied to that too. And the one today, oh, this is so much fun. Scientism. Science can save us.
Yeah.
Not Jesus. We don't need Jesus.
Follow the science.
We need science. Like, oh my gosh, I'm not even going to start.
Right.
That is like one of our things.
Before we move into the shift, there's one more schism.
We might do this.
We really, I know.
We might get this done.
Not if you don't subtract. There's one more schism I want to touch on tonight that actually flows out of Vatican II. You may have heard of this group. It's called the Society of St. Pius X.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? The Society of St. Pius X. Very complicated situation, but essentially the basis of it is there's a French bishop named Lefebvre who after Vatican II was like, no, I don't like anything you guys just said, and we have to maintain the Tridentine Mass, that all Latin Mass. We have to maintain that. The new Mass that came out of Vatican II is called the Novus Ordo. If you go to Mass here on a Sunday, that's what you go to, Novus Ordo. Bishop Lefebvre said, that's not a valid Mass. That's not a valid Mass, and we can't have that, right? So he started this group called the Society of St. Pius X, and basically broke from the church, although he claimed that wasn't his intention, but essentially that's what he did, right? Because he wanted to maintain that Tridentine Mass, only that Mass. That's still a valid Mass. You can go to a Tridentine Mass, that's fine. But the Novus Ordo is also a valid Mass, and he didn't think it was, right? So they named themselves after St. Pius X. And in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI invited the society back into communion with Rome, but they must accept two things. They must accept the magisterium, which is the teaching of the church, right? And they must accept Vatican II.
Formally. As a,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So far, they have done neither one of those things. Okay? And what's interesting is they take the name of Pius X, but Pius X actually made a statement about not disregarding the magisterium. He actually made a statement in 1909 about groups that disregarded the magisterium of the church and that was not okay, right? So it's just very ironic. There's, I mean, like we get stuff, you know, from all of these people celebrated a sacrament at a church that's Society of St. Pius X. Is it valid? I got to look that up. Because some things are and some things aren't. It really just depends on where they fall in the.
That's a legitimate schism.
It's a legitimate, well,
Yeah,
technically it's not called a schism at this point in time.
It's not. Because they still have the door open.
They still have the door open, and some of their things are still considered valid, but illicit. So if you go to Mass at a church that's a Society of St. Pius X church, you go to Mass there, it's a valid Mass. It's just not a licit Mass, which means it doesn't go according to the law of the church. But their priests, some of their priests are validly ordained, and some of them aren't. Right?
It's a mess.
It's really a huge mess. It's a huge mess.
So this is an age of constant change.
Right?
The shift, unprecedented culture shifting by the generation, never before seen levels of prosperity, unbelievable shifts in technology. Can you, I mean, just look at what we've seen in our lifetime. It is
Amazing.
unbelievable
Amazing.
to even get our head around. But the thing is, less and less need for faith, less and less reliance on God, less that God will provide because everything else provides for us, right? The explosion in communications, from written letters to telegraph to radio to telephone to television to, oh my gosh, modern computers, all the rest of it. All of this has happened in just a little over 100 years. right? Our modern, this modern age of all this stuff, and right alongside the way that this has shaped the culture for the gospel, it's also shaped the culture for evil, right? There's some great things. I cannot believe what we can get on our computers.
It's amazing.
That's the good stuff. I mean, I cannot believe the good stuff that we can get, but also where, again,
Can't believe the stuff you can get on your computer.
just like we've said before, where evil abounds, grace is going to abound all the more. The 1900s saw the greatest leaps in human technology in any era of human history, right alongside the greatest wars and the greatest horrors ever committed. This is nowhere near a comprehensive list of wars. This is just, and I was going to put the numbers of people estimated killed behind it. It's so overwhelming. It would not fit. But just, I mean, these are just a few of the wars. I mean, we've heard of a lot of these. Obviously, World War I, II, Spanish Civil War, the Chinese Wars, the French Indochina War, Korean War, Cuban War, Vietnam, the Six-Day War, Iran, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, the Balkan Wars, Rwanda. The genocide in Rwanda by itself is a horror story. It happened in 1994, for crying out loud. This was really recently. Within the Catholic Church, there's a renewal of spiritual power aligned with a rediscovery of the roots, right? We've looked back at the roots of what the early church fathers taught, and there's like this rediscovery of, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. How do we teach it now? John Paul II's pontificate energized the youth and converts with a new evangelization that's nothing short of a revival, while at the same time, church attendance and participation in some areas has plummeted to unsustainable lows. Ouch. We're not able to keep our schools. We're not able to keep our churches. We're not able to keep our institutions because the numbers have, the priesthood, because the numbers have plummeted. When I started at Queens several years ago, there were 400 kids in the school, 400 kids in the religious ed program. We would do 100 baptisms every year. There were like 70 first communions, all that. The 50 or 60 weddings every single year. The numbers are decimated today.
Yeah.
It's really, really overwhelming.
Yeah.
But we're seeing a little bump here at the Mother Church of Jackson. We are seeing a little bit of growth, and it appears to be, this is my take on it and what a lot of other folks have been saying. It appears to be a great shaking, a great pruning of the bushes, where depth is replacing width.
Yeah.
People are going, this is what's really been on my heart lately. The Lord is really moving people deep. There aren't as many, but the people that are here, like, it's going really deep. And I really think the Lord is preparing us for the age ahead, for what's about to come. Some say from Our Lady of Fatima, she said there would be an era of peace after a time of purification. So a really rough time. I don't know, the 1900s sounded pretty rough.
Pretty rough.
Whether that was the rough time of purification or if there's something else coming, people argue all that. But a lot of folks believe we're about to enter an era of peace, like real, genuine peace. The girl from Fatima, Lucia. Sister Lucia, who is the little girl from Fatima that lived a long time. She just died not long ago. She said the era of peace that will come. She said Mother Mary promised it. She said the era of peace will be will be the greatest miracle, second only to the resurrection. Because the world will see a level of peace like it has never seen. I hope she's right. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Some believes we're entering the end time. There's going to be the great time of tribulation. Catholics believe this too, that there will be a great time of awesome tribulation, terrible stuff, before Jesus returns. Others believe it's just another turn on the spiral and on the cycle of history. And it's going to go on for who knows.
till it stops.
We don't know.
So God says,
It's just going to keep
we're
on
done.
going. And it's like, it seems like it's the worst, and then it gets better, and then it's,
Yeah,
we don't know.
we don't.
We pray about it. Okay, we're going to do this.
Okay, we're gonna do it.
Round and round and round she goes. Where she stops, nobody knows. Do you see the cycles like this in your own life? Oh, man. Do you see potential for sainthood right next to the potential for genocide? Maybe not literally in our own lives, but stuff like that. Who makes the difference in that, right? Who makes the difference? And here's what we really want to leave you on, and then you've got something good too. In all of this has been like my theme for the last couple of years. Do you recognize that in the history, all the history before this, we just started with Jesus, right? All of the history before Jesus, all the history that we've covered here, these 2,000 years, all the history yet to come, we have no idea how many thousands of years or how many minutes are left. In all of that, in all of human history, God placed you here. He chose now for you. I praise Jesus I was not born in the French Revolution, or I wasn't born in the Middle Ages during the plague, right? Or I wasn't born when Rome was being burned. I praise him so much. I'm like, thank you, because you know that I wouldn't last in that environment.
I am far too weak.
Thank you for putting me here. But there's a reason we're here now. And I think if nothing else, that's one of the things I really want us all to ponder. Why does he have us here? What is our mission? And Angel had a thought too.
So going along with that, right? Because God has a purpose for your life, right? He has a purpose. That's why he put you here and now. He has a purpose for your life at this point in history, where you are, when you are, surrounded by the people you are, right? And so that specific role is something that only you can fulfill. Only you can do your purpose that God created you for. How you're called is unique to you, right? And so my question then is, in a few hundred years from now, when somebody far in the future from us is studying church history, what will they say about how you answered your call? Right? We've talked about a lot of people over the last 6 weeks. In their time, in their moment, they answered a call, right? They found their purpose. And they lived it in such a way that here we are today in 2020 talking about them. And maybe that won't be you. You might be one of the unnamed people, but you'll have a purpose here and now that in some way carries on through church history, right? Carries into the future of the history of the church. How will you pass on your purpose? How will you pass on the church history? Because, we're just like at a point in time. There's 2,000 years of church history behind us, like Todd said, plus all the time before Christ, right? And there's however much time there is in front of us. And we're just passing the bucket of our faith along down that line. What's your bucket look like? How are you passing the faith? How are you living in your moment? Right here, right now, where God has called you to.
And the amazing thing is through all of this controversy, war, confusion, and schism, that faith has been passed on. It's only passed on by people, right?
Right.
It's just one person telling another person, all the way back to Jesus. And somehow we're still doing this. Like, this is the only institution in human history that's still doing what it set out to do 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
There's nothing else quite like this. And it's a mess, yes. And it's a beautiful mess.
There's a great line from Vatican II. I want to say it was Pope John Paul II that said it in part of the conversation at the opening days of Vatican II, but I could be mistaken. It might have been somebody else. But I want to say it was him. And he made this very profound statement at the beginning of Vatican II when he stood up and said, kind of drawing on the point of this council, like why they're there. And he kind of said, church, what do you say of yourself? Who are you? Right? What do you say? Talking to the body of Christ, not to the men gathered in the room, right? What do you say of yourself? Who are you? And that led into those discussions that brought beautiful documents, gave us great teaching, right? So to us, you know, what do you say of yourself? Who are you?
Awesome.
Yay!
Hey, you hung with us 2,000 years and 6 weeks.